Hi, welcome to this third part lesson of our series on many-to-many relationships. And before we dig into the code, I just want to show you how our application will work. So as we are talking about the specific controllers and views, you can have a picture in your mind of the functionality that those are implementing. So here's my updated cheese MVC application. So the homepage is still pretty much the same. We have a listing of cheeses, and we can add a cheese via the form. I've updated the navigation a little bit just to be focused around cheeses, categories, and menus. Those are our three core model classes. And so this functionality works the same, even though the UI has been reorganized just a tiny bit. As before, you can add categories and view the categories view via the categories controller. And so you can see that functionality here. And then finally, what's new is the functionality that's contained under the menu controller. So under my menu controller, I can create a new menu. So this index view just lists all my menus. It also gives me the option to create a menu. That option is under /menu/add, so it's under the add action. And I can create a new menu, and all I have to do to create that is just list the name. The activity of adding cheeses to that menu is a separate view and a separate action. When I create that menu, I am then redirected back to the list of all menus. When I click on a menu, I will see the items in that menu and have the option to add more items. So here, this menu is new. It does not have any items yet, but I can click on Add Item to add an item to that menu. So this presents just a new form, which consists only of a drop-down. I'm able to select from the existing items in the system. Notice the URL up here. This is at the path menu, add item 2. So this is going to be in the menu controller, the add item action, and this is going to pass the ID 2 to that action, and that ID corresponds to the ID of the menu that we're adding to. All right. So let's go ahead and select a cheese from this menu. I think, well, it's probably, I don't have any French cheeses in this menu, but yeah, why not? This is just practice. And if I add that, we'll see that when I go back to view this menu, I do have that cheese listed as being a part of that menu. And you can just add several. Each one will continue to, to be added to that list. Parmesan is not French either, but that's okay. We're just playing around with the data. Let's see what happens when I try to add an item twice. So I've already added Swiss. Let me try to add it again. And that was not added again. I could have been helpful and put a little message on the screen saying that it wasn't added because it's already there, but at the very least, it didn't add it twice, which is what we'd hoped. That we would hope that we can only list one item in a menu once. But yeah, that's the way this works. So if you go back here, you can just kind of peruse and browse this data as it exists in the system. Okay, so I'm going to go to Visual Studio and stop the application. And let me just mention that something I did by necessity before this was to run the migrations associated with the model changes we made last time. So I don't want to kind of brush over that. That's an important part of the process. What I did to do that was once I made changes to that model, I went into PowerShell and I said .NET EF migrations add, and then I named my migration. In this case, I called it add menu. And then after I ran that, I ran .NET EF database update that applied those updates to the actual database. Okay, so that's an essential step in working with Entity Framework. Every time you make changes to your model, you need to create a migration and then apply that migration for those changes to be reflected in the database. Okay, so I did that in the process of setting up this example code, but I kind of out of necessity had to do it already to test that this example code all worked before presenting it to you. So it didn't make sense to do live in the lesson, but just don't forget that you have to do that. Okay, so once again, this code, we're not going to live code here. We're going to be walking through some existing code, and you'll be guided through the steps to create this code yourself. Let's go to the menu controller. This is where all of the new controller code is in the application from last time. Okay. And in the menu controller, I have a CheeseDB context, and I've inserted this into the controller in the same way we did in previous lessons where we have a private field that's read-only, and then we also have a controller that takes a CheeseDB context and sets that equal to, or sets our private field to be equal to that context that's passed in via the controller. Recall that MVC will take care of the work of actually calling that controller and passing in a DB context for us. So all we have to do is declare these things at the top of our file, and everything will be initialized for us when we start up our MVC application. And then I can use this context throughout the rest of my class. Okay, so we're going to look at these actions one by one and just describe the activity associated with each action, and also just look briefly at the views associated with each. So recall that we're in the menu controller here, so we've already seen what happens within each of these actions. The index action is going to just list each of the menus. And so here, as we've done before with cheeses and categories, we can get a list of all menus in the database by saying context.menus.toList. And then I pass that into the view. Let's go ahead and look at that view. So this view looks similar to other things we've done. The view will, it has a link here at the top to add a menu, and we'll see what that action does in a second, but it links to the add action of the menu controller. And then I loop over the list of menus. In this case, I've just declared at the top as an enumerable. I loop over the list of all of the menus, and for each menu, I create an LI element, and inside of that, a link, and that link will go to the menu controller and the ViewMenu Action. So each menu here is going to have a link to a page that will display the items within that menu, and so I have to set that up properly. I set that up by saying menu as the ASP.controller attribute, ViewMenu as the ASP action attribute, and the ID of the particular menu as the route ID parameter, and then within the link, I give it the name. Okay, and I'm able to reference these particular properties off of each menu because I've used this ViewModel syntax and declared that the model for this view is this class. Okay, so we've seen all these concepts before. Let's go back to the menu controller. Now, add is going to get a little bit more sophisticated, although it's not that different from things we've done before. So there are two add actions here. One is going to display the form to add a menu. The second is going to validate and then process the form data. So this is the menu or the form rather, to add a new menu. So it really only has, one piece of form data that it needs, which is the name of the menu. So I do have a view model for it though. So let's go ahead and look at that view model. The add menu view model. There we go. Add menu view model. So the only piece of data that I need to create a new menu is the name. And here, it might seem like this is a super small class. Why did I do this? Well, I did it so that I could reasonably validate it and kind of use the built-in MVC validation mechanism. So I'm able to make a name, make sure that it's required. I could have put a length here. That would have been a good thing to do, but we didn't. At least we know that that's a required property. And I've changed the display of this so that when my form renders, instead of saying name, it's going to say menu name, which is just a little bit more useful for the user. So that's what that view model does for us. So in the action that's associated with a GET request, I create a new view model and pass it into the view. That view also is pretty simple. It has a form with a single input for the name property, and a submit button. Okay, so there's nothing new in this form. We've used all of these concepts before as well. So that's what allows me to display the form, to process the form. I'm using model binding, and I'm using that add menu view model. So I'm taking that in, using model binding. I check to see if it's valid, so that's going to make sure that the user actually entered a name. And then once I know that it's valid, I create a new menu object. I add it to the menus collection in my context. And then I save my changes, which actually pushes the data for that new object into the database. And then I redirect to the main menu view, which will display a list of menus. Okay, and of course, if it's not valid, I return to the same view that I came from, passing in the view model, which at this point is going to have validation error messages associated with it. Okay, so let's look at this next action. This is the ViewMenu action, and it takes a single parameter in, which is ID. And so let's go ahead and let's see if we can find it. Oh, I guess it's going to be in here in the index. Right, so recall when we looked at the index that this displays a list of the menus, and I set this up so that the link for each menu is going to go to the menu controller, the ViewMenu action, and it's going to pass in the ID parameter that corresponds to the menu's ID. So when I actually call that action, when someone actually clicks on that link, this action method will be called, and this is going to be a GET request because they're just clicking on a link, and I'll get that menu ID passed in. So this ID matches this part of ASP route, okay? So I'll get the menu ID that they're asking to look, and so we want to just display all the data associated with this particular menu. In particular, we just want to display all the items that are in the menu. So here's where we can use our DB context, and this is the first real kind of usage of the new functionality that we've wired up with this many-to-many relationship. So I want to display every single cheese that's in the particular menu. So to do that, I want to retrieve a list of cheese menu items. So recall that we don't want to retrieve a list of cheeses here. We want to retrieve a list of cheese menus because the cheese menu objects are what describe the relationship between the two classes, between the cheese class and the menu class. So I use the context and I say I want to get context.cheeseMenus, and recall that I have to include every property within that is also stored in the database. So let me go ahead and pull up the cheese menu class just to remind you of what that looked like. The cheese menu class has a menu ID and a menu, and then a cheese ID and a cheese. And so these two properties, menu and cheese, are sort of non-primitive, right? So these are properties that correspond to other classes that are also stored in the database. So when I'm retrieving the parent class, cheese menu, from the database, I have to say that I want to include those properties that are inside of it. By default, EntityFramework will not query for properties that are inside of a persistent class. We have to tell it that we wanted to do that as well. So I say include item.cheese, and I use this Lambda syntax, this sort of syntax we've used with link before, to say that I want to include the .cheese property of every single item. And then I put a further qualification on it, which is I say I only want to retrieve those cheese menu items where the menu ID property matches the ID property that was passed into my controller. Okay, so that filters the entire list of cheese menus, or the entire table of cheese menus, down to only those that correspond to this particular menu that we're looking at here. So this is where that join table is going to allow us to determine these relationships and filter down to only the items that we want. And then as always, if we want a list of those things, we have to call the toList at the end. Okay, so I'm also going to want, this will basically give us a list of the cheeses. Like, I said it's the list of cheese menus, but each of those cheese menus has a cheese property, so we can, from that, easily get each of the cheese items in our list. I also want the menu itself though, right? So let me go ahead and just fetch that menu. And the reason I want that is I'm going to pass both of those into the view model for this particular view. So that view model is called ViewMenu ViewModel. It takes a menu, and it takes a property called items, which is a list of cheese menus. So let's look at that view model there. That is the ViewMenu ViewModel. And it just takes those two properties. So that's really all it is. We pass that view model into our view. Let's go ahead and find the ViewMenu template. So at the top, I've declared my view model. I use the menu property of my view model to display the name here. So that's pretty much all I needed that for. I'm also going to need it for the ID down here, but we'll see what that does in a second. I'm going to display the title of this page as being the name of the menu that we're looking at. And then I'm going to loop over the items property. Recall that the items is a list of cheese menu objects. And so I can get cheesemenu.cheese.name and that will display the name of every item within the list. So even though we're interacting with the menu items as this list of cheese menus, we really have an easy way to get the cheeses and the specific menu items that are within that, because this linking class, this cheese menu class, has data for both sides of the relationship. Okay, this is just a quick message to say that if there's nothing in the list, it's pretty obvious to the user that that's the case. And then at the bottom, I have a link to the menu controller and the add item, and that is going to allow me to add a new item to the given menu. And I identify that by passing in the ID parameter as model.menu.id. So when the user clicks on this, they'll go to the add item action, and the ID will be passed in to say that they want to add an item to this specific menu. Okay, and so we'll look at that add item pretty soon. Okay, so that's the view menu functionality. And really the new pieces here for us, just to recap that, the only real new piece was that in displaying the list of items, we had to use this intermediary class or these intermediary objects that are holding on to the relationships between our menus and our cheeses. All right, and then we have two more actions here that are kind of a pair. And these are the actions that are going to display and process the form to add a new item to a menu. So that is what we just looked at. We just looked at that link that would take someone to this form within the view menu view. And so here, if I want to add a new item, I'm going to need to know the ID of the menu that I want to add it to. So the URLs that will come into this will be something like /menu/add item / some numeric identifier that says that they want to add it to, for example, menu 3. Okay. So within this action, I'm going to need to build up a view model. Let's look at what our view model is here. We're in the add menu item view model. This view model is definitely our most complex so far, because it's going to need to do several things. We have a menu and a list of select items that correspond to the cheeses. This is going to be used to build up our dropdown. I have a menu ID and a cheese ID. These are going to be used on the submission of the form. So these top two are used on the rendering or the displaying of the form. These bottom two are going to be used on the submission of the form. And they're the data that's going to allow me to create a new relationship between the given menu and the given ID. Let's see, then I have the nowhere constructor. We need that for our model binding. And then I have this other constructor, a non-default constructor that will allow me to build this on the rendering side. So we're going to use this non-default constructor when we want to render the form. To render the form, we need to know information about the menu, and we need to know the list of possible items that we could add to that menu. So here, I just create a new list of select list items, and as before, when we've dealt with these select list items, I build them up based on the IDs of the items in the list, in this case the cheese.IDs, and we have to call toString on those, and then the names of those, which will be what's actually displayed in the select lists. So those are again, concepts we've seen before in a slightly new context. And then I set my menu property within the class. So that's our add menu item view model. Let's go back to our controller and see how we use it to render the form and process the form. Okay, so in the add item action that's responding to a GET request, that's this first action here, we use the ID that's passed in, and we use that to fetch the menu from the DB context. And so this is, again, this isn't new syntax. We learned this in the last lesson or two. And then we also use the context to get the list of all of the cheeses. And so the idea here is the form is going to correspond to a specific menu in the sense that we want to add a new item to a specific menu. We also need to present all of the options for adding, right? And so we need to present a dropdown with all of the menu items that are available to add to the specific menu. And so we're going to pass into our add menu item view model a list of all of the cheeses in the system along with the menu itself. So this view model gets passed into the view. Let's look at that view. Here we are in the add item template. And this displays the menu name at the top along with a little message describing what we're doing. And then our form has three inputs, well, two inputs rather. It has the drop down, the select item that's going to display the list of available cheeses to add to the given menu. And then it's going to have this input that allows the ID of the menu to be submitted as a piece of form data as well. Okay, so just because we passed the menu into our view model to render it, that doesn't mean that that's going to be passed back in to the view model when we process the form, right? So in the middle there, that object gets lost when that page is sent back to the user. So we need to retain this piece of information to say, here is the menu ID that we're talking about. And so this is a piece of data that the user really shouldn't see, but we want to keep and make it available for our application. So what we do is we make it an input of type equals hidden. And its name is menu ID. Recall that this was a field in our view model, our property in our view model, rather. And then the value of that is just going to be fixed to the menu that we're looking at. So this input will be within the form. It'll be sent with our form data back to the server, but it won't actually be visible to the user. Okay, and then this dropdown is rendered in the same way that we've rendered select lists in the past. Okay, so when we go to process the form, when the form is submitted, it's going to be posted to the same URL. Actually, it's slightly different. Let me go back to this form. There's one. Yeah, so I did add the action, the controller in action here. So the difference here is that this one will not have the /ID on it. That will be contained, instead of being part of the URL, it will be contained in the form. So it's almost the same URL. But when our form is posted, this menu item view model, add menu item view model, will be passed into the form via model binding. We can check that it's valid, and we can check that the validation annotations that we had on that class are met, satisfied. And then we can use the cheese ID and menu ID. We can pull those out of the form, or out of the view model rather, and we can use those to build a new cheese menu. So we have these two IDs, and we want to create a new relationship between the cheese with the associated ID and the menu with the associated ID. And we know that we can do that via this intermediary class, this join class called cheese menu. However, if we try to create a relationship that already exists, then we'll get an error when we try to push that data to the database, right? So recall that together, a cheese ID and a menu ID make up the primary key for a cheese menu object. In other words, we can only have one, for each pair of IDs there, we can only have one entry in that table. So if we try to insert an entry that corresponds to a pre-existing relationship, in other words, if we try to add a cheese to a menu when it's already in that menu, then we're going to get a database error, because you can't have two rows with the same primary key in a given table. Okay, so what we're going to do first is we're going to check to make sure that we don't add the same item to the menu twice. Okay, now one approach to this would be to just not display those items in the dropdown, and so we'll make that a bonus mission if you choose to take that extra step. But at the very least here, we want to prevent the user from experiencing an exception when we try to insert data and get a database exception. Okay, so to do that, we're going to basically query to see if there are any existing items that meet these criteria. So I use the DB context, and I'm looking for cheese menus that have the given cheese ID and the given menu ID. So I say context.cheesemenus, and then I add two where clauses. The first where clause says, look for cheese menus with the given cheese ID. And then the second where clause says, out of those, look for cheese menus that have the given menu ID. And so if that list has items in it, at most it's going to have one. It'll either have 0 or 1. If it has 1 in it, that means that relationship already exists. We don't want to try to create it again because we would get an exception. If the relationship does not exist and the list is empty, then we will go ahead and create a new object and put it in the database. So you might ask why I didn't use the .single here. And the .single method for a DB set is kind of picky. So if you ask for .single, it's expects that there actually is one specific entity in that table that satisfies the given conditions, okay? So it will return .single will actually throw an exception if it either finds more than one or if it doesn't find any. So here we're expecting that we might not find any, right? So we want that to be a normal situation, so we don't want to deal with an exception. So instead of calling .single, we call toList, and then we're able to check the size of that list, and that's a more reasonable way to approach this. So we check right here, we check the size. If that list is empty, that means there aren't any rows in the cheese menu table that have this specific pair of IDs. Then I can go ahead and create a new object from those IDs. And so I do that, and I do that using these particular queries to retrieve those single items. And then I add the menu item to the cheese menus collection, and then I save my changes. Okay. And then this redirect here is just going to go back to view the specific menu that we just added the item to. So once you add an item, you bounce back and you view that menu with the new item added to it. Okay. And so one thing you could do here is if this menu, if we had a situation where someone tried to add a menu item that already existed, we might display a message saying so. We'll add that as a bonus mission as well, but we haven't done that specifically within our code. And then this down here at the bottom is just the situation in which your model was not valid, in which the form data wasn't valid. So in that case, like always, we return back to the same view and display the validation errors. So that's an overview of the functionality in this application that we've added. Most of the things that we've done here, you've done before. The newness is interacting with these many-to-many relationships and the classes that connect those relationships via Entity Framework and the DB context. And so, you'll get used to that. There's a couple details that you'll get used to. But again, we're going to walk you through these in detail via some written instructions and an in-class activity. So you'll get hands-on practice at doing this, and you'll be fluent in it in no time. So that's it for this lesson on many-to-many relationships, and happy coding.